Sarah, Duchess of York, never quite fitted the royal mould. Even the nickname Fergie persisted, reflecting her determination to remain herself. The flying lessons, the frequent skiing holidays, her appearance, and the design of the new home given to her by the Queen all excited comment and controversy. It had all started so well. A strong character, she was one of the most influential women to become Duchess of York. But as an adventurous contemporary woman with an independent outlook, her attitude and ideas didn't sit easily with the rigid protocol of royal life. Her clothes reflected a lack of judgment. Her overfamiliarity with the press raised eyebrows. She seemed extravagant with money and managed her own affairs badly. As a member of the royal family, the artificial constraints and strict scheduling of public life went against her own preference for spontaneity, enthusiasm, and easy laughter. For a while, Fergie was a breath of fresh air. But when the story broke that her marriage was on the rocks, it was amidst reports that she and Andrew were often heard shouting at each other behind the stuffy walls of Buckingham Palace. It was soon obvious that their relationship had moved beyond repair. Fergie had been crushed between a hostile press and a royal system that had failed to give support. Her need for company while her husband was away at sea had damaged her own reputation and reflected badly on the royal family. But what does royalty do when the wife wants out? Is the British monarchy itself under threat? In this democratic age, royalty has had to widen the circle of potential marriage partners to include commoners. But the Duke and Duchess are yet another example of an experiment that's failed. So where does a royal family go from here? Sarah Ferguson had seemed the perfect raw material for a royal consort, someone who embraced her new status with determination and enthusiasm. But somehow she fell foul of the media and the royal system. Where did it all go wrong? The British royal family is a tightly knit group with its own unique lifestyle. Its members are very wary of outsiders. But, like the previous Duchess of York, now the Queen Mother, Sarah Ferguson's entry into the ranks was welcomed. For them, Prince Andrew couldn't have chosen a better wife. They admired her sensible attitude and strong personality. The Queen immediately began referring to her as "my daughter." And the Queen Mother summed her up by saying she's so English, so free of all those airs and graces we can't stand. With an ancestry rooted in the land and services, her family background was also impeccable. The Queen had known the Fergusons for 3 decades and had watched this high-spirited redhead grow up. Sarah's enduring interest in horses, polo, and other country pursuits particularly endeared her to the Queen, and from the beginning they were often seen at equestrian events together. Horsemanship of any kind is a central interest for all the royal family. But when the press gets in the way, the Queen is not amused. The relationship between these two women was always very relaxed.
They're both outdoor, horsey, doggy sort of women. And the Queen also likes people with personality. And she finds Sarah an amusing companion. They get on very well, far better, in fact, than the Queen gets on with Diana, who she finds more difficult and more restrained when she's with her.
Fergie quickly became known as the Action Princess. Her mother had taught her to ride almost as soon as she could walk, and at a special fun day at Ascot, she gave an impressive public display of her own equestrian skills. But she was perhaps best known as the Flying Duchess. Determined to learn all she could about her husband's work as a naval helicopter pilot, Chatterbox 1, as she was dubbed by a traffic controller, was the first royal lady to get a pilot's license, and then took less time than her husband to win her wings for helicopters. As she herself explained, "I now know exactly what he's talking about when he comes home from a day's flying." But her most controversial activity was skiing. She was first put on skis when she was 4 years old, and it remained an obsession. But the Prince and Princess of Wales were also keen skiers. She rivals Charles in skill and speed, and both enjoyed competing on the slopes. For Fergie, skiing was a vital outlet for her energy and love of speed. She certainly outclassed Diana. Despite these joint holidays, Fergie's skiing exploits were singled out, and the sport's image as the elite pastime of the jet set soon added fuel to the media's growing criticisms of her leisure pursuits. She was portrayed as a parasite, shirking her public responsibilities in favour of personal indulgence.
Because they're sort of so-called glamour sports, really. I mean, she once said to me, if only it was tennis, no one would mind, but because I want to go skiing, people feel that it's a glamorous thing and perhaps not something a Duchess should be doing all the time. But I mean, other members of the royal family do it and don't get criticised. It seems that everything she does is open to criticism.
But her commitment to public duties seemed real enough. As a naval wife, she could have got away with only the occasional public appearance, but she took on a heavy schedule and launched into crowds with a bustling enthusiasm eager to make contact.
What's your name? Are you in charge of all these lovely ladies? Are they all your girlfriends? Yes, they are. Oh, well, he's Stephen. Oh, yeah, no, we're not the boys, the girls. Thank you very much. Is that for me? When you grow up, you're going to give your girlfriend lots of flowers.
No, why?
What's your name? Thank you, Rachel. That's me. Thank you very much. Aren't I lucky? All your mummies are going to get...
Her early career in public relations stood her in good stead. Unlike Diana, she needed little coaching before being confident enough to go it alone. But this maturity created problems in itself.
The Duchess of York, who arrived in the royal family when she was quite mature, 25, 26, had been around the world, she didn't hitchhike, but she'd travelled widely, the way lots of young women do, and to suddenly step inside this great institution, this machine that swallows people up and decides what they will do, must have been very, very difficult to adjust to, especially as, instead of having a sort of gentle introduction to it, she was dropped straight into it and she began doing a lot of official jobs almost immediately after the honeymoon.
At 26, she wanted to bring her own ideas to the job. As one departure from the norm, she chose to support Tracy Edwards and her all-woman crew for the Whitbread round-the-world race in 1989 with their yacht Maiden. She admired their courage and determination, and such a challenge appealed to her own sense of adventure. But one of the most unexpected and frustrating aspects of her new royal status was the sudden lack of personal money supply. She'd been used to earning her own living and spending her own cash.
If you want to go out for lunch with your girlfriends, you need £50 or something. Where is it going to come from? Well, the men in the Windsor family don't understand that because they don't go out for lunch like that. I mean, the Prince of Wales never goes out to restaurants that I know of for meals at all. Prince Andrew lives on a Navy base most of the time, works in Navy establishments. He doesn't pop out very often. Occasionally he takes his wife out for dinner somewhere at a nice restaurant, but that would be the bill would be sent, or a policeman will pay with an American Express card or something. They just don't deal with money. So they can't understand why a woman would want to have some Reddies.
The irony was that despite this behind-the-scenes cash flow problem, Fergie was gaining a reputation for extravagance. Again, it was her skiing that gave rise to these accusations of being spendthrift.
She's probably not very wise with her money. But I mean, she doesn't have a great deal of it to be wise with. I mean, she's made money out of her writing, which she's perfectly entitled to do. And indeed, when she came into the family, when she first got engaged to Andrew, Prince Philip, actually said it's nice to have someone in this family that makes their own living. And then it seemed to be everything she did that was good to start with seemed to go against her.
Before Fergie became part of the royal family, she'd had a 4-year love affair with a millionaire entrepreneur from the Formula One racing world. Paddy McNally was still an enduring influence.
Paddy McNally was a sort of father figure to her, and he was the sort of man, he'd always tease her. He'd tease her about putting on weight, he'd tease her about eating chocolate, he'd tease her about her hair, he'd tease her about everything. And she loved him very much, actually. And but I'm sure their marriage would not have worked between them. I mean, he was 20 years older than her, but he was a sort of a rock for her, although he undermined her confidence tremendously by always having an eye for, you know, someone else, somebody younger and prettier. So he knocked her confidence. But he was there for her and is still there for her as a friend. And I respect the way he's never, ever said a word to anyone about his relationship with her. So there's got to be some good in him there.
Fergie's mother, Susan, filed for divorce in order to marry Argentinian polo player Hector Barrantes. 4 years later, Ronnie Ferguson also married again and started a new, much younger family. Fergie was fond of both her step-parents, and although newcomers to the royal family usually found their own relations pushed into the background, she was determined that none of hers would be left out. It helped that her father, Major Ferguson, was already Prince Charles's polo manager, and the increased press exposure soon made him into an internationally known media personality. Such notoriety had its flip side, though. In September 1988, stepmother Susan and Fergie were at Smith's Lawn to give public support at Major Ferguson's controversial departure. It was a brave show of solidarity for a crowing press. A ceremonial stick marked the end of his many years as deputy chairman of the Guards Polo Club, after tabloid newspapers revealed details of his visits to a massage parlour in London's West End. It was an emotional farewell under a cloud of scandal. The club committee had voted him out, and the message was clear. For the 57-year-old father of a royal duchess, it was a humiliating rejection. Despite pressures to distance herself, Fergie was there to give her support. For both of them, it was a case of putting on a stiff upper lip.
All I can say, on behalf of all of us here, I personally feel it's a tragedy that you are leaving the club. And God willing, you will be back with us. You won't be polo, I know that. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a lump in my throat. 3 cheers for Major Ronnie! Hip hip! Hip hip! Hip hip!
Fergie felt very responsible for what had happened and stuck by him throughout the ordeal.
I think that's one of the qualities I admire about her, her loyalty to her father and her sister when they have had unpleasant publicity. And I think she feels that if it weren't for me, they wouldn't be the focus of all this attention. Who would be going around checking up on her father or her sister if they weren't related to the Duchess of York? And so she feels that it's in a way her fault they've had these problems, and she would like to help them as much as she can. And so she stays very, very loyal and devoted to both of them.
But it was her relationship with Andrew that most interested the press. The prince had first been attracted by her lack of reverence towards him and enjoyed her no-nonsense attitude to life. To begin with, they seemed perfectly matched. As Fergie once said, "He's my main right arm. He's the one who gets me through." Their arrival in Cloisters for the wedding of friend and Swiss ski guide Bruno Sprecher brought the world's press to a private celebration. On a less happy occasion, this same man had saved Prince Charles's life during the avalanche that killed Major Hugh Lindsay. But the Yorks were still behaving like newlyweds themselves, and their own marriage's physical warmth was there for all to see.
I know how devoted she was to Andrew, how much in love they both were. I mean, to be with them sometimes is almost embarrassing. They were so, tactile, and they just couldn't leave each other alone. And it was something that made you feel quite warm and happy just to look at them. And I don't think that sort of thing goes away in a hurry.
This personal happiness also showed in their public duties. To begin with, they carried out a lot of official engagements together. Businesslike, but with their own brand of informality, they made a good team. Fergie seemed determined to make a go of her new life, and that included creating a new home. Sunning Hill Park, 5 miles down the road from Windsor Castle, is rumoured to have cost almost £5 million. It was the Queen's wedding present and took 4 years to complete. Incorporating staff quarters and nursery wing, plus swimming pool, tennis court and stables, the 50-room mansion looks more like a Texas ranch than a traditional English stately home, and was nicknamed Palace Dallas and South York by the press. Sarah's first pregnancy was a difficult one. She expanded from a size 12 to a size 16 and felt continually sick. With Andrew away at sea, she also had no husband by her side to comfort her and had to cope alone. But with the arrival of the Queen's 5th grandchild, Beatrice Elizabeth Mary, the discomfort and long wait seemed worthwhile. Born at 8:18 on the 8th day of the 8th month of the 88th year of the century, the new princess's timing, according to Chinese astrology, heralded great good fortune. "My daughter's gorgeous, but I'm biased," was the proud father's verdict, while her mother immediately nicknamed this new redhead Baby Beetroot. Even the press celebrated this latest royal addition. But Fergie as a mother was soon under attack. Andrew had to leave on a 6-month naval tour of duty to Australia immediately after the christening. Fergie soon flew out to join him, leaving behind her 6-week-old baby.
I think she was really dropped right in it, and she was floundering for a while, you know, especially after she had Beatrice and she went to Australia and left the baby for 6 weeks. People thought that was appalling. Now, the truth behind that story is that is what the Duke of York asked her to do. And she felt, as a good wife, and the fact that he'd been away from home for most of that year, she felt she owed it to him to give him her total undivided attention, you know, tender loving care, etc. He'd been home a very, very short time that year. And so she thought the baby wouldn't miss me. But basically she was putting a good face on. I'm sure she didn't really want to leave the baby, but he wanted her to, and that's the main thing. And so that's what she did.
Back home, her public duties continued, her visits distinguished from those of other royals by a relaxed chat, even in the most formal surroundings. She'd mastered the fine art of small talk to total strangers. Determined to be professional, she hid a basic shyness behind a supremely confident manner.
No, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, I hope so too, yeah. Exactly.
Often disregarding protocol, she relied heavily on her instincts to guide her, always trying to cover as many people as she could.
Gotta go.
Her transparent eagerness was frequently off-putting to those who expected a more reserved royal family, but she refused to become more aloof. As she said herself, "I'm not going to change, why should I?" But she seemed easily distracted if things bored her. Even during a long and tedious speech, a ladybird by her feet should have been ignored. But she couldn't seem to leave it alone and keep her attention on the job in hand. It was a telling episode. If there was a charm school for moulding royal duchesses, this was one pupil who'd failed to conform to the straitjacket of royal caution. Fergie's girlish exuberance persisted. It was a straightforwardness at odds with the carefully structured and often monotonous nature of royal duties. Such non-royal behaviour had been excusable in the beginning, but her learning curve seemed to have taken a wayward turn when it came to patience and standing still on parade. But when a bit of action was required, she was in her element. Audience participation was what she was good at, and if some balloons needed to be cut loose, she would wrestle with the wind and wield the scissors with enthusiasm to get them airborne.
What's attached?
Told you it's like a children's party.
The press were becoming more and more critical of her excitable behaviour, and her lack of decorum generated an air of disrespect at ground level too. One awkward situation occurred when she was taken past Wormwood Scrubbs prison and had to acknowledge the ribald comments of inmates before embarking on an official visit to a hospital. Being royal certainly does involve submitting to a bizarre range of public appearances. Sometimes it really is just like a children's party. Crowds of overexcited onlookers, sports personalities, clowns, cartoon characters. The role demands considerable versatility as well as polished performance skills. When on form, Fergie seemed more than equal to the challenge, but more often she never quite seemed to find the right tone, the right level of involvement. At times, her enthusiasm led her into picking the wrong event, inviting ridicule and even contempt. Far more popular abroad, where her feisty, independent manner was admired, at home she was considered over the top. The press had now definitely singled her out as the royal to put the knife in. Andrew wasn't around to help, so where were the advisors to assist a commoner through this public relations minefield?
There is no job description for people coming into the royal family. There's no job description for a princess. There was no job description for Mark Phillips when he came into the royal family, or Anthony Armstrong-Jones when he came in. And we all know what happened to those marriages. And I think with the Duchess of York, if somebody had said to her, well, don't you think you might do this, you might do that, you might curtail things? And I believe the one person who could have done it would have been the Princess Royal, because she was born royal, she'd never been anything other than royal, and she knows exactly how to behave at all times.
But sometimes she did manage to turn her enthusiasm to good effect. All the bad publicity her love of skiing had received ignored her valuable support for the Combined Services Winter Sports Association and her particular interest in their disabled skiing program. She was a major factor in this charity's fundraising, and despite being pregnant with Eugenie and unable to ski herself, she made the trip up the mountain to watch the races. But first, an unscheduled stop to sign a plaster cast.
I'll draw one of mine for skiers.
This is a real bonus.
Such frequent acts of impulse created havoc with the carefully timed official schedules, causing irritation and resentment amongst royal staff, used to a more ordered way of doing things. But despite all her gaffes and upsets, such spontaneity revealed a warm heart.
There we are. Please, madam. Please, madam.
The association organises many events, and here at Megève in the French Alps, there were the full range of races, including the slalom for disabled skiers. At the final prize giving, Fergie's role as president became more formal, including, much to her amusement, the provision of an exotically coloured throne. As usual, her relaxed manner and humour cut through the stagey setup of the presentation ceremony. Never at a loss for words, she would always rise to the occasion when an off-the-cuff speech was called for.
I'm not going to sing a song, and I haven't prepared a speech, but I'm so pleased to be here today. I mean, it's just wonderful. I mean, it's not very much snow, and I think you've done a fantastic job.
But her main charity interest was far from the glamorous environment of the ski slopes. Motor neurone disease was little publicised before Fergie took up the cause. As yet incurable, the disease leads to total incapacity and is often fatal. On a visit to a group of people with the disease in Australia, her sincerity and determination to be their voice was very obvious.
Hi, Johnny. Nice to see you. Yeah, you've got to keep strong. We're on our way to find a cure for it. I know. It's very difficult, isn't it? Very difficult. She's going. It's anything I can do. I'm shouting about it, so I'll just keep shouting, Johnny. Okay? I'm going to need a throat for you, Johnny. Because we've just got to keep on fighting. That's what we've got to do. And as I said to Rose, we're gonna knock it on the head one day. But I think people are beginning to realise that when I get up and make a speech now, I normally mention it. So people are beginning to connect the two. So they are beginning to start, because I find that when I start talking about it, they say, what is motor neurosis? When you're feeling isolated and alone, I haven't forgotten you, and I'm out there fighting for you. So we're going to get there. We've just got to keep going.
But such work got little press coverage. This was due both to media bias and also the unphotogenic nature of the causes involved.
I feel she hasn't had a lot of the credit she deserves for her charity work because unlike the Princess of Wales, she's not involved with cute little babies who look gorgeous and snuggly and cuddly. They may be dying of AIDS, but it doesn't look like it when you see them in the pictures. The Duchess is involved with people, paralysed people suffering from motor neurone disease. I mean, the Motor Neurone Disease Association is probably her main charity. And these people don't make pretty pictures, but yet she does some magnificent work with them. I remember in Australia we went to visit a clinic where there are a lot of people in wheelchairs, and one of the men there was at such an advanced stage he could no longer speak, and he felt so frustrated at not being able to talk to her when she came round to sit with him that he began to cry. And she held his hand and she said, "Don't worry, I'll be your voice, and I'll make the world listen to us. I'll keep on shouting and telling them until, you know, they listen to us and we find a cure." And it was magnificent stuff. And there was a television crew there practically in tears. They were all so moved. Everybody in the room was so moved. And a lot of newspaper photographers. And they all said, "Oh, we can't use that. That's too upsetting for the breakfast tables of Britain." They wouldn't use the pictures. They said, "Oh no, the man doesn't look very good, and you know, it's not nice." And so she has that problem repeatedly.
The press always seemed far more interested in making unfair comparisons between Fergie and the Princess of Wales's appearance. She was portrayed as a laughable contrast to the tall, elegant Diana, a dumpy figure of fun who liked flashy colours and over-the-top outfits that seemed totally unsuitable. She just didn't conform to the stereotyped dress code of a royal family judged for its shows of restraint and good taste. In her previous life, clothes had never been a priority, and high fashion had always bored her. Such an individual mode of dressing could have worked, just as the Queen Mother's unique style became part of her public success. But Fergie's vibrancy grated. She just seemed too theatrical, and as ever, she was facing a hostile press. Her whole appearance became a constant target for ridicule. She was also up against some stiff competition in Diana, but the image-conscious Princess of Wales had known exactly where to go for good advice.
I mean, Princess Diana did have the people at Vogue to help her. And just as I was saying, there are no royal lessons, and perhaps somebody should have drafted, probably not the same people, but some other people as well versed in fashion to help the Duchess of York. It's not that she doesn't have a good eye or a sense of style. It's just that different things photograph differently. Different things are suitable for different things. There are problems when you get out of a car and the world's press is waiting, just waiting to take a photograph. There are problems when you've got to look sort of elegant for hours at a time, so things shouldn't crease. Things like putting sort of LA at the back of a hat was probably meant to be very sweet to the people of LA, but of course was immediately pounced on by the sort of style experts here as being very déclassé. I think that the Duchess of York's very lively and buoyant and thinks that life should have a funny and a witty and amusing side. And I think that the establishment and the fashion establishment wants fashion taken terribly seriously and perhaps didn't agree with her ideas.
The popular press didn't seem to agree with any of her ideas. They swarmed around her, ready to catch any unguarded moment. No matter what she did or how she looked, the story was always a negative one.
In some ways, the press perhaps have been rather difficult when it came to Sarah, because I think the Duchess of York came along. She was so different from the Princess of Wales. I think the press were so terribly sizist, you know, so that every time she left the house, she must have felt, oh, I look the wrong size, I am, you know. They criticise her fashion sense. They criticise everything about her. I think that it's very difficult to have an image when you're not sure perhaps what your own image is, and perhaps you're not obsessed by it as some people in the limelight are.
Pregnancy proved particularly difficult, a time when choosing clothes for public view became even more of a nightmare, and often looked as much. Both times she expanded to alarming proportions with a huge accompanying weight gain. Even afterwards, she found this extra weight difficult to shift. and the tabloids pilloried her unmercifully. Such unrelenting personal comment was difficult for anyone to cope with, and she took it badly.
She had figure problems, figure faults that got publicised heavily, and that kind of thing makes any woman terribly embarrassed and upset. And I think nobody realises how upset she used to get and how she used to sit at home and cry about the cruel things that were written in newspapers. And people thought she was a figure of fun, and because she wasn't so close to the throne, they thought that they could more or less say whatever they liked about her in the press. I mean, you wouldn't say such things about Diana, not only because she's slim and gorgeous, but because she is right up there, you know, the next Queen of England, and a bit of a sacred cow. And editors tread very warily around Diana. But Fergie, well, she's never going to be queen. She's way down the pecking order. And so I think they decided that once they could get away with it, they kept doing it. And she didn't have the clout or the influence to get it stopped. It's very difficult to stop things like that. So all these freebie Fergie, you know, fun-loving Fergie, all the other ones, you know, the Duchess of Pork, etc., all these names became gospel.
Andrew, of course, wasn't around much to offer advice or support against this press onslaught. His naval commitments frequently took him away, leaving his wife to face the music alone. But would this freewheeling, self-centred prince have really understood her problems anyway? What kind of a man is he?
Spoiled, difficult, but charming, very naive, and very immature compared to the other men that Sarah's known in her life. But I think, you know, he has got some guts in him, and I just think if he just sat down and you know, considered that there are other people in the world besides him, you know, his life's going to be a lot happier. I think he has to stand up to his father, which is difficult, and he has to communicate with his mother. I mean, life hasn't been a bowl of roses for him. It's been very protected, and that hasn't really prepared him for the rigours of everyday life. I'm not talking about his life in the Navy, I'm talking about emotionally. He's immature.
I think most people, when they meet Prince Andrew for the first time, they think he's a very physical person, which he is. He appears to rush at you. If you go into a room and you're being presented to him, you know, you normally give a neck bow when you meet a member of the royal family. He holds his hand out, and he's aggressive, almost like an American. Americans are quite aggressive when you first meet them. They appear to be as if they're trying to dominate you, and he does this. He also shouts. He appears to bark quite a lot, as his father does, whereas Charles and Edward are extremely quietly spoken and a little bit retiring, quite reticent, I suppose. They're very reserved. He is not in the least bit reserved. He's very exuberant, very high-spirited.
Andrew has also been called arrogant, too aware of his own position. He often lacks patience, particularly when people get in his line of view.
That way, somewhere over there. Come on. Not for your benefit, please move.
Marriage did seem to broaden his outlook, but as one friend said, imagine what it's like being married to a man who's never eaten a Big Mac, been into a pub or been shopping in a supermarket.
The Windsor boys are not generous with their money because they haven't had to live like you or I have. They haven't had to go out into a pub or a supermarket, buy a round of drinks. They don't know the price of food, or they certainly don't know the price of clothes. Certainly don't know the price of women's clothes, although I'm sure Prince Charles has got quite a good idea by now, because he must have seen enough bills. But they are not renowned for their generosity. And I don't think that's really an inherent Scottish meanness. I think it's really that they just have no idea what things cost.
As wife to a prince, Sarah suddenly had to look the part. Now in the public eye, it was expected that she maintain a smart, well-groomed appearance for every occasion, something that inevitably costs a considerable amount of money. Diana could draw on her allowance from the Duchy of Cornwall. Fergie had no such fund. By the end of the marriage, her overdraft was well into 6 figures. In the early days, the two sisters-in-law grew to be close friends. Both were commoners, and both had married men who were the products of the same very unusual childhood.
I think there's a very real argument to support the theory that these boys will never, ever be able to have what is regarded as a normal relationship with their wives not what most people regard as a normal relationship with their wives. Because of their relationship, they were brought up by nannies. They have the nanny mentality, and they're always looking for another nanny because they didn't have a mother in the real sense of the word. This is not to blame the Queen in any way. It's merely because she's had to be the head of state and act as Queen and head of the Commonwealth throughout the lives of her children. And I think it has affected the relationship that the boys have had with her, with the rest of the family, and with relationships that they've established outside.
The Queen herself feels very responsible for any new additions to the family. When she was first married, Prince Philip had also been away at sea for long periods, and she sympathised with her daughter-in-law's difficulties in trying to build a home life with an absent husband. It was a big send-off at Portsmouth docks. The Queen was taking her one-year-old granddaughter for her first cruise on the Royal Yacht Britannia. Andrew, for once, was on leave from his own ship, so it was a chance for them to be together as a family. The Queen admired Fergie for maturing her most wayward son.
The Queen was very devoted to Sarah. At first she was fond of her because she had taken that playboy Prince Andrew. We've forgotten now that he was Randy Andy once upon a time. Now he looks like a very boring, sober family man, you know, in the suburbs. And she changed him. Sarah Ferguson changed him from being a problem prince into a nice, settled family man. So the Queen would love her for that. She liked her for what she is, which is a very charming person. But I mean, I hear all the time that the Queen goes over to Sunning Hill Park for afternoon tea and to play with the children whom she adores.
To begin with, they seemed the perfect couple, besotted with each other and unashamedly tactile in public. Their family life appeared relaxed and open, despite the constant attentions of the press. Beatrice soon had to face the spotlight too, but she'd obviously inherited her mother's sociable disposition and was a natural for any photo call. On Mothering Sunday 1990, Andrew became father to a second daughter, and the first visitor at London's exclusive Portland Hospital was Beatrice, come to see her new 7-pound 1-ounce sister Eugenie. Another early visitor was Diana. The sisters-in-law had now managed to produce the perfect balance of boys and girls, royal cousins for a dynasty that seemed to be going from strength to strength. Fergie soon emerged as a radiant mum with a new baby. The Yorks' happiness seemed complete. For both of them, marriage had provided a strength and stability. For Fergie, this was something she'd craved ever since her own parents had split up when she was still a schoolgirl. The future seemed very rosy, but history was about to repeat itself. Not many months later, cracks began to appear in the fairy tale facade. Andrew's duties were still taking him away for long periods. For a naval flying officer, family matters have to take a back seat. Left at home, the loneliness of being a naval wife was beginning to take its toll, a situation only exacerbated by her growing isolation within the royal family. She was struggling with the mounting problems of trying to build a successful public role, while rumours were rife that she was finding support and even romance elsewhere. She needed help, and there was none around.
There's no charm school for princesses or duchesses. There's no one that sort of stands up and a guru that advises them. I mean, Fergie didn't have anyone like that, desperately needed someone, I think. She had the advice of her father, which sometimes wasn't the best advice, and her mother was away, and she had the advice of her friends who didn't really know. There was no one really to help her, no one that she respected enough to listen to. And I think this is probably one of the problems of people marrying into this family. There's no one to tell them what to do and what they can and can't do, because you can't, your former life just doesn't come into play when you marry into that family. You just cannot do any of the things that you did before.
Perhaps that had been her first mistake. Her refusal to forsake her skiing holidays ruffled feathers both inside and outside the palace. Horse riding was another interest she persisted in, but at least this pursuit fitted more easily with the royal family's own obsession with horses. But she can hardly be accused of not taking an interest in her husband's activities. She took on the challenge of learning how to fly, specifically to bring herself closer to him. As she said herself, "Flying is his life, and I want to be a part of his life." Not many wives would have carried their devotion to such lengths. Chameleon-like, she was willing to take on another's interests for the sake of a more understanding relationship. The effort was all there, and yet the marriage failed. Perhaps it was because she wasn't a typical Windsor woman.
The fact that she can go on places like abroad and do speeches in French and German, which the other Windsor women can't do. She's so different in a million different ways. She's more like an ordinary woman, career woman of today. And they are really like women of 100 years ago. And I think that sums up basically the problem.
There's no way that Fergie felt she would be beaten by the system, but I think in the end it did beat her. And I think you can't marry into that family and retain very much individuality, which is very sad because that's what we all like.
The pressures of an unhappy marriage were clearly beginning to show. For such an exuberant personality, she seemed uncharacteristically withdrawn and depressed.
I think she needed time on her own to think. Also, she was so stressed out. I mean, even the last time I saw her, which was last year, at the end of last year, she was so stressed, I couldn't believe it. She was really thin and pale, and she just didn't know what was happening. And then she had this terrible turmoil, and the announcement and the separation, and then the absolutely horrific press intrusion. And she just had to get away, else I think she would have burst.
When rumours of problems within the marriage began to leak out, the news hounds scented blood and went in for the kill.
And the report's due, Mum.
As ever, personal problems were suddenly considered public property. There was nowhere to hide.
It's just the media, basically, I think, that has really destroyed Sarah's happiness, in a way. And when she's getting attacked from the outside by the press, the palace began to see that, that she was very unpopular. Then she began perhaps to be getting attacked on the inside from the family or the palace, and that was the end for her. She couldn't cope with being attacked on all sides, and she just wanted to go away.
But the show must always go on. For generations, the ceremony and mystique of royalty has been carefully maintained. The myth is perpetuated that the royals are a world apart, something removed and unreachable. All the pomp and circumstance is just a part of representing stability and continuity, of giving the public what they want. A cleverly orchestrated management system creates this facade. Most of what the world is allowed to know about royal goings-on is channeled through an extremely reticent press office. In keeping with modern trends, isn't it time that the presentation of royal family matters is made more open?
The danger is then that the members of the royal family will be seen to be media fodder, rent-a-royal if you like, and the press office will be seen as a public relations office, which they're very anxious to avoid. They don't want to be seen as being in the public relations business. So at the moment, they have to handle essentially what is their main function, which is looking after the public duties of members of the royal family, but more and more, of course, in the last couple of years, they're being asked to handle also the private family affairs, the state of marriage of 3 of the Queen's children. I mean, because as you know, there's a constant spotlight, and there is constant speculation about the state of the marriage of the Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales.
Prying eyes into her family's personal lives is a phenomenon the Queen finds difficult to understand. Like many of her subjects, the British monarch is typically restrained when it comes to inquiring about other people's difficulties. Keeping up appearances, no matter what happens, is a vital part of the royal family firm. As a mother, the Queen finds it difficult to face up to family problems.
The Queen will go to almost any lengths to avoid confrontation. She simply doesn't like confrontation with family business at all. She leaves most of that sort of thing to Prince Philip anyway, who doesn't avoid it. He doesn't mind confrontation at all. But the Queen will avoid it, and she is very likely, if somebody went up to her and said, look, don't you think it's time you had a word with Diana or with Sarah about the state of their marriage, she would be just as likely to say, I think it's time the corgis had a walk in the garden, and she would walk away, she'd walk away and leave it, and believe that it would have disappeared when she came back. She simply would not involve herself in any of the private squabbles, relationships of her family at all.
But with the Yorks' breakup coming so soon after Princess Anne's, the Queen now faces a possible threat to the future of the monarchy itself. The Prince and Princess of Wales are still together, but what if royalty ultimately proves to be a role you have to be born and bred for?
The difficulty is that in previous generations they would have married, they would have had arranged marriages. They would have married somebody from the European royal houses, and their brides would have known what to expect. They would have known the form, and had there been any private disagreements between them, these would have been kept strictly private and certainly wouldn't have been aired in public. They wouldn't have dreamed of making announcements to the press or going to the media in general. And I think this is the difficulty, that now they are having to look wider for their partners. They're marrying commoners, and it doesn't seem to work.
By the year 2000, Fergie, together with the Princess of Wales, could have been one of the main influences to take the royal family into the 21st century.
Aren't they? Thank you. That's good. Did you do that at school? Is that for me? Yes, it's for you. Oh, how wonderful. Big letter, isn't it?
Fergie seemed to have all the right attributes, but as it turned out, she possessed a stubbornly independent spirit that was just too much for the Windsors and the royal system.
They don't particularly want women like that in the family. They are too independent and free-willed for the palace. The palace wants somebody who's willing to be content with just, well, charity work can be very rewarding, very satisfying, but where is the talent that she's got being expressed if you just do charity work? You know, she wants to find her own avenues to express herself.
I don't think perhaps that Sarah Ferguson was the right type of woman, although it appeared to us she was, because she was too independent, too vibrant, too lively. I mean, if she'd been more subservient and sort of the little woman at home, there wouldn't have been so many problems, because she wouldn't have expected so much from the marriage. I think, but then obviously these boys are not attracted to those little women at home. So it's a dilemma there. Yes, they don't really meet enough of the right sort of woman, but then what is the right sort of woman? It's very difficult, I think, to be a prince of the royal blood and find the right woman.
It all began with great expectations. Outside this charmed circle is new territory. What will happen to the first female ex-royal? What does the future hold for Fergie?
Everything she does is going to be monitored by the press. She's always going to be an object of ridicule. And if she gets close to anyone, I think it's going to be very difficult for her to form another relationship. She is the mother of the Queen's grandchildren. So I think it's going to be very hard.
This is the story of a girl who had everything and threw it away. Sarah Ferguson, once Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York, is now in exile from the royal family, a single mother forced to exploit her name to wipe out a huge tax bill. Today, Fergie wishes she could return and talk to the young bride she once was. Ruefully, she looks back at the royal lifestyle that was hers, a world of first-class travel, green light traffic, and five-star luxury. Gone now is the background organisation that ensured her public duties ran with regal smoothness. Like her friend Diana, Fergie is a divorced outcast from the royal family. At the christening of her first baby Beatrice, Fergie seemed to have achieved all her ambitions. But within a year, she started the perilous descent into disgrace and removal from the royal fold. She rarely saw her husband, and while she and Diana relished much that royal life provided, they kicked against its restrictions.
No one can marry into the royal family and have an easy, happy life. I mean, Fergie's not the only one. Diana, you know, even other people I could name and won't because they're still married and they're putting up with an awful existence. It's so incredibly difficult to adjust to that life, to become a prisoner in a golden cage. It's a life in which you make endless sacrifices. There's no freedom. And this is why, you know, Diana and Fergie both wanted to escape. It was a life they began to loathe. They just felt if you have only one life to live, it's impossible to live it happily inside a royal palace.
By selling her book My Story in New York, Fergie is working to clear the mountain of debts accrued during the wild, reckless years that marked her passage from grandeur to downfall.
Hi, how are you?
It is a life far removed from the royal one which made her famous. Without the protection of bodyguards, she is open to casual autograph hunters, like a fading film star. The architect of her final humiliation was John Bryan, an American businessman with an elevated opinion of his sexual and financial prowess. He followed his friend, the handsome Texan oilman Steve Wyatt, in Fergie's affections during her husband's long absences at sea.
Began her relationship with Steve Wyatt in 1989. She was then 3 years into her marriage, pregnant with her second child. She was seeing her husband then on average between 40 and 45 days a year, or at least that's how many evenings they were able to spend together. There was a huge void in her life. I think these men filled a void and yet didn't detract from her relationship with her husband because they were friendly enough when they saw each other.
Following her disastrous affairs and her departure from the royal family, Sarah strives to maintain the style she knew in her 10 years as the Duchess of York.
Sarah, straight ahead. Sarah, straight ahead.
Aware of her limitations, she admits in her book, "I was never cut out for royalty." She adopts instead the pose of a show business celebrity in a Hollywood style unlike the staid traditions of the British royal family. It was those customs that she had tried so diligently to imitate in her eagerness to impress her in-laws. Although Andrew disliked horses, his family built much of their social life around them. Sarah gladly showed off the equestrian skills learned on ponies in her childhood. Despite early worries of Fergie's suitability, she and Andrew seemed an ideal couple. Fergie brought a fresh wave of popularity to the royal family. Behind the often bouncy exterior, Fergie was really an underconfident girl she herself calls the pleaser. Fergie's slimmer and prettier mother, Susie Barantes, had left her husband, Major Ronald Ferguson, when Sarah was 14. Susie set up home in Argentina with her second husband, Hector Barantes. Fergie had finished her growing up under her father's guidance.
Major Ferguson, essentially, when his wife ran off to Argentina with Hector Barantes, really didn't pay his daughters very much attention. Jane ran off to Australia, Sarah went off to school, and really never had that strong father figure in her life. It's something that I think she suffers from even now.
Sarah's father remarried and had a second family which brought additional responsibilities. While Sarah loved her easygoing stepmother, Sue, her father's new family meant that she had to stand on her own feet. Major Ron served as Prince Charles's unofficial polo manager and kept many royal secrets, despite temptations to tell all. But Major Ron's own weaknesses were exposed when a tabloid paper revealed a massage parlour scandal. His daughter and his colleagues showed their loyalty by standing by him the day he was forced to resign from the Guards Polo Club.
Whatever I can say, on behalf of all of us here, I personally feel it's a tragedy that you are leaving the club. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a lot to fight for. 3 cheers for Major Ronnie! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! You're rather interrupting us. That's it, that's right.
Major Ron kept the support of Sarah and Andrew until he wrote his autobiography, which Sarah felt betrayed her.
He said very revealing things about the royal family, things about the Duchess's relationship with Prince Andrew, and speculation about how it could evolve that really surprised the Duchess and I think upset her a great, great deal.
She was appalled when he wrote that book about his past and all the scandals that he'd been involved in. It didn't help her at all, but she's now forgiven him.
Through polo, Fergie met up with Lady Diana Spencer. Sarah was already enjoying a freewheeling life in London and Europe. She was the older and wiser friend the innocent Diana needed. Diana wanted Sarah as her lady-in-waiting, but her wishes were denied by palace officials. There was already a palace connection. Major Ron's first cousin, Sir Robert Fellows, was Assistant Private Secretary to the Queen, as well as Diana's brother-in-law. At Diana's wedding, Fergie, on the right, wearing a dress given by the bride, enjoyed an honoured front-row place beside the flatmates who had also supported Diana. As she saw her friend pass into royal life, Sarah had no idea that within 5 years, she too would marry a prince. Although Fergie knew much about Diana's secret misery, she was attracted to the luxury and privilege which surrounded the princess. As her marriage was privately disintegrating, Diana maneuvered Sarah into royal life by inviting her on various family occasions.
Diana was very, very responsible for bringing together Andrew and Sarah. It was exactly what she needed, a pal at the palace. And so she went to work on Fergie, and at the first chance she got, which was when the Queen asked her to suggest some people for the 1985 house party during Ascot Week, that she suggested Sarah Ferguson, and the Queen thought it was a good idea. And of course they met at lunch, and they hadn't seen each other since they were children, Andrew and Sarah, and when they got together again, he realised what fun she was. He was on the loose, looking to settle down, and she fell for his charm. He is a good-looking chap, and he has a very sweet nature, Andrew. And so it didn't take much persuasion for her to fall in love with him. He wooed her with bouquets of red roses and quiet dinners, and they even went to an Elton John concert together, hoping that someone would spot them and they'd have a bit of fun, you know, ducking and diving from the press. But it didn't happen. And all the while, Diana encouraged them. She allowed them to meet secretly at Kensington Palace, and she arranged little weekends and dinners for them. And she gave them every possible encouragement, because she was very lonely and she didn't feel that there was anybody in the palace that she had much in common with. So Sarah Ferguson was exactly what she needed.
Diana's matchmaking was a success. Sarah and Andrew married in Westminster Abbey in July 1986. Unlike Charles and Diana, the newlyweds were obviously a love match. But their surface happiness hid a deeper truth. They were marrying on the rebound. Andrew had ended a romance with Coo Stark, and Fergie's previous love, Paddy McNally, a self-made millionaire 22 years her senior, had refused to marry her.
Probably she did marry Andrew on the rebound when Paddy McNally made it clear that he wasn't going to marry her. But it seems to me she falls in love rather easily. And she'd always had a yen for that glamorous royal world that Diana had entered. And I think it was a lot of factors, not just Paddy McNally, that influenced her.
When Sarah and Andrew married, Archbishop Runcie said the royal wedding was a precious gift to the nation, and on that sunny, happy day, who would have disagreed? The Queen's joy was unmistakable. She had seen her favourite son married to a lively, uncomplicated girl who quickly became her favourite daughter-in-law. The royal family had an exciting new member, one who might deflect the growing estrangement between the Prince of Wales and his troubled wife by being the companion she badly needed. Diana had been a teenage friend of Prince Andrew, but had married his older, more complex brother. By the time of Andrew's wedding, Charles claimed his marriage had irretrievably broken down. But on this day, Diana hid her personal turmoil to share the happiness of her friend. The new Duchess threw herself wholeheartedly into the royals' public life. Ascot, where Sarah had first attracted Andrew in 1985, became an annual highlight until their separation 7 years later, when she was banned from the royal carriage parade. Her exuberance and over-familiar manner did not please everyone. Fashion critics slammed her varied taste in clothes. Behind the scenes, she was the recipient of carping criticism from palace officials and from some of the royals themselves.
I think within the royal family, the person who she seemed to be most afraid of was Prince Philip. Early on in the marriage, apparently he had told her, now that you're a member of the firm, you can do anything you want, but you'll always be caught out. And she was always frightened about that. One time she walked into a room where the Queen and Prince Philip were going to have dinner with her, and she greeted each one of the servants by their first name. And when they sat down, Prince Philip turned to her and he said, "I thought you gave up flirting with the servants ages ago." And, you know, she was riveted by these one-liners that he'd come up with periodically.
Princess Anne, who had marriage problems of her own, was unsympathetic to Fergie.
Anne once called an outsider at a family lunch, and there was a furious row between Andrew and Anne. Fergie walked out the room in tears. Andrew demanded that Anne apologise, which she did, but after that, you know, there was a very, very frosty relationship between Fergie and Anne.
The public viewed Sarah differently. On a tour of Canada in 1987, Sarah generated excitement with her enthusiasm and sense of fun. Her unique style made her popular, especially in the Commonwealth, where the young royal wife was on display, just as Diana had been before her. Every aspect of Sarah's performance, from her manner to her hairstyles and earrings, was monitored by the press and the palace, and not always favourably. But the Yorks made a good team, as Sarah had promised they would. Andrew was devoted to his good-natured, fun-loving wife, who had taken away his stuffiness. He shared her spirit of open friendliness, so different from the formality of his family.
The commentator's delightful phrase, it's wild, it's woolly, it's Western, and good watching. Like my wife. Sorry.
Others found her weak points, her weight and her clothes. She was cruelly nicknamed the Duchess of Pork and a style-free zone.
Clothes are props to her. She has to wear them. She's not very interested in them. She'd rather go horse riding or skiing. All I know of her is a warm, generous woman who's totally without any vanity whatsoever. That's why she's so often photographed looking not exactly her best. She doesn't think about putting on makeup. She just thinks, oh, what have I got to do? And she dashes off and does it. And I find that rather endearing. She's not like the Princess of Wales, who spends hours beautifying herself and is working out endlessly and, you know, going to aromatherapy sessions every second day. She's just not like that, and that's why she gets into difficulties with her weight sometimes. She is just not a vain woman. In that respect, she resembles the Queen.
After the birth of Beatrice, the Queen gave Sarah and Andrew a belated wedding gift of a mansion to bring up their family. She tried to ensure their happiness. Sunninghill was based on an American house Fergie had seen in the rolling countryside of Connecticut, but squeezed into a smaller plot near Windsor and altered to suit Andrew's preferences, the new building was lacking in grace and charm. Dubbed Dallas Palace because of its vulgarity, it became a monument to bad taste. Naturally, it attracted the attention of the press. It was the Yorks' third home in as many years. Sunninghill became the setting for the dramas which ended their marriage. Here, Fergie's money problems started to become unmanageable.
She and Andrew, I think, at their largest ever income was about £200,000 a year, which went on staff salaries, pensions, medical benefits, and endless other costs involved in running a royal household. They had a staff of at least 25 people. You may say they don't need so many, but, you know, that's the way you're expected to live. And after those salaries were paid, then she got money to buy frocks or Christmas presents or whatever. Now, it just simply wasn't enough money to live on, especially when she was endlessly compared with Diana.
Andrew was a serving naval officer sent away for long periods at sea. Sarah was often alone. These absences were a crucial factor in dividing the couple.
She says that he was home for only 47 days out of 365. Now, it was appalling. I mean, the way they treated them both, they were given something like a 3-day honeymoon alone in the Azores on the Royal Yacht, before the Royal Yacht had to steam home for the Queen to go on her Western Isles cruise, and Andrew and Sarah had to go along with all their in-laws. I mean, it was just ridiculous to treat a young couple like that. They had no time to get to know each other before he was off and away again.
Sarah tried to cope with the empty spaces in her life by taking flying lessons. Becoming Sarah the action woman helped her to deal with her problems and to understand her absent husband by emulating him. Skiing was another escape from palace protocol. She relished the freedom and thrill of the mountains. But as the Royal Duchess, Sarah believed she had to help others. So in her favourite sport, she tried to help publicise the achievements of handicapped skiers.
I'm not going to sing a song, and I haven't prepared a speech, but I just am so pleased to be here today. I mean, it's just wonderful. I mean, there's not very much snow, and I think you've done a fantastic job, because seeing those conditions out there with that ice, I think you're all amazing that you're all here in one piece anyway.
Her mixed motives attracted the criticism of the grey men at the palace. They were unhappy about her tendency to be drawn into commercialisation. She would face the world bravely, but go back to rebukes from the Queen's advisors at the palace. Beneath a tide of savagery over her clothes from fashion writers and sneering remarks from courtiers, Sarah's confidence was slowly eroded. Her high-volume contribution to the TV programme It's a Royal Knockout earned her more hostility.
Sarah was expected to turn out, get on the Royal Roadshow, roll around the country and go abroad as if she'd been doing it all her life, without any preparation or any training or any support whatsoever. And I just think it's too much to expect. And when you run into difficulties, they have a policy, you know, never complain, never explain in the royal family, just get on with it and don't, you know, go to anybody else. Don't seek support or help. You've got to be self-reliant and solve your own problems. And of course, when you turn to your spouse, as she did to Andrew, you say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't find that. It's not like that for me. Because they're born royal, so they get all the encouragement, support, advice, everything they need is just laid on for them, and it just isn't for the people who are their partners.
In August 1989, Sarah, Andrew and their daughter Beatrice joined the Royal Yacht Britannia en route for Balmoral. The Queen was happy to be seen with her favourite son and her favourite daughter-in-law. Fergie was already pregnant with her second child. Within months, her journey would take her on a new and dangerous route. In November, she met handsome Texan playboy Steve Wyatt. Their affair involved secret trysts at home and abroad.
Steve Wyatt was the main reason for the breakdown of her marriage. Fergie fell head over heels in love with him. She met him at a time of her life when she was exceptionally low, felt Andrew wasn't supporting her. She went to Texas and she met a very handsome and rich Texan who was very attentive, very loving, and they very quickly fell in love. And Steve Wyatt was the real love of Fergie's life. Andrew may have been her best friend, and he probably still is now, probably always will be, but Steve Wyatt was the love of her life. And she was devastated when the affair ended. It left her totally broken. She dreamt that one day they'd be together, hopefully living in America. She was forever making dreams in her head.
When Steve Wyatt was living in England throughout 1991, he was trying very hard to establish a fortune for himself. He's the stepson of a very rich man, Oscar Wyatt, who has refused to give him money during his own lifetime. And so Steve simply is not as rich as people believe, although the Duchess found that out the hard way. And when she realized that he wasn't rich, he said, I'm going to go back to America, to Washington, and make my fortune. The Duchess actually helped outfit his apartment in Washington, filled out his Christmas list, and had every intention of waiting for him till he made the adequate amount of money, and then they were going to get married. The relationship ended because Steve distanced himself from her. He started getting just really, really lax. One time I was with her and she said, I called Steve up and you know what he told me? He's in the middle of watching a football game that I should call him back after halftime is over. And this kind of stuff pushed it too far and she just got the feeling she wasn't wanted anymore. And then he got involved with another woman.
When Princess Eugenie was born in March 1990, Fergie was still hopelessly in love with Wyatt and hoping to marry him. She played a charade with her husband, who refused to listen to gossip, treating Wyatt as a friend. Taken in by pictures of family togetherness, the public had no idea of the truth behind her facade. Wyatt returned to America, but he left Fergie a parting gift, his friend and relative by marriage, John Bryan.
To the comments and statements I made last night.
She probably might have stayed married if John Bryan hadn't come along. But he was such a persuasive, forceful character, quite frighteningly so. I mean, I can understand why she got involved with him. He was great fun, and I'm sure initially he lightened her load. He provided her with a lot of happiness and a bit of relief from the grind and the ordeal of facing people inside Buckingham Palace, which she had to do at that stage. And he also said, look, I can do everything. I'm going to take all your problems away. I can do, work miracles. And he convinced her of that. I mean, he convinced me for a while that he was going to do what he said he could do. It was all, a farce. He was just a con man, really.
John Bryan's hold over the Duchess was primarily because she perceived him as being a very wealthy, powerful, influential man that could aid her in the transition from her royal life to a successful commercial life. He kind of advertised himself as a very wealthy, successful businessman, which he was not. And it's quite funny, too, because he kind of enlisted me to help him with this illusion. And I told him once, John, what if she finds out? He said, well, I just have to make the money before she finds out I don't have it.
Both Fergie and Diana consulted astrologers and psychics in attempts to foretell the future. Fergie turned to Greek-born Madame Vasso to discuss her men.
Both were trapped in unhappy marriages, desperate to see what the future had in store for them, and that they believed by, speaking, consulting to people who, with psychic abilities, that they would know how it would turn out and whether there was a sort of, light at the end of the tunnel. The husbands were very different problems with both their husbands, but both were unhappy and wondered whether things were going to work out for the best.
Although Fergie trusted Vasso like a substitute mother, she didn't always follow her advice, particularly over John Bryan.
Vasso told Fergie 1,000 times, "That man will bring you nothing but bad news. Get rid of him. I don't like him. I don't trust him." And Fergie didn't listen to Vasso. Perhaps if she did, she wouldn't have been in the mess that she was in. But Vasso met John Bryan on a number of occasions, and even went to his flat on a number of occasions when he asked her for readings. Didn't trust him, believed he was only out for what he could get for himself.
Fergie even ignored clear evidence of Bryan's double dealing.
Sarah was ill, and Vasso used to frequently send Fergie flowers, and she rang up John Bryan and said, "Look, I've got a nice bouquet of flowers to cheer Fergie up. Will you take them over for me?" So he picked them up and delivered them. And the next day, Vasso rang to ask, what she thought of the flowers. And Fergie said, "What? The flowers were from you? I can't believe it." And Bryan had just delivered them as his own. I mean, it's only a small point, but it shows what sort of a man he is.
Fergie's adventures with her American lovers had not gone unnoticed by the Queen's top advisors, the grey men behind palace walls. Her two embarrassing affairs convinced her enemies that she should be removed from the royal family. But the knives were out for Fergie. While Sarah was in private discussions with lawyers, news of her impending separation was leaked to the Daily Mail, much to Sarah's horror. The palace had seized the initiative to remove the Queen's daughter-in-law from her royal duties.
Sarah firmly believes that there was some kind of plot against her because she was not ready to leave Andrew when she did. She was forced to because the story was leaked to the Daily Mail. And she believes that she now knows who leaked it and that they had some Machiavellian plan to get rid of her. Perhaps she wouldn't have left Andrew if that story hadn't emerged the way it did. Certainly, she was blamed by the palace for leaking it, and she was totally innocent of that because she wanted to make a lot of plans and to be sure she was doing the right thing. And she was totally unprepared when the story came out, and the separation was quickly announced. She was put in a terrible position.
Fergie found hostility within the royal family. Prince Philip and Princess Anne were already critical. Now Princess Margaret took their side.
The Duchess of York had sent flowers to Princess Margaret with a little note, no doubt trying to renew their once good friendship. And the flowers had been sent straight back with a note from Princess Margaret saying, "How dare you send me flowers? Have you ever considered what damage you've done to the royal family?" And I thought that was the worst example of a pot calling a kettle black in history, because it was perhaps in the 50s and 60s, but Princess Margaret was notorious for her behaviour. It was totally out of keeping with her position. So I think that Princess Margaret was cruelly unfair to do such a thing when it was a kind gesture from Sarah, very well intentioned. And I think that indicates exactly how the royal family treats somebody who steps out of line, except if they're born royal.
Aware of her sister's antipathy, the Queen still continued to offer her troubled daughter-in-law her personal support, encouraging her to attend various family events.
Over the years, the Duchess was quite convinced that the Queen was hoping that the Duchess's fight against this bureaucracy that had taken over the monarchy was going to be a successful one. And the times that I thought it was most drastic, the Duchess used to go over and see the Queen on Sundays with her children very often. And she'd come back with varying degrees of enthusiasm of the support that she was being promised by the Queen. But at one point, the Queen invited the Duchess to come for the Christmas holidays, but to stay in a farmhouse. She wanted to see her grandchildren. She told the Duchess, if you come, you know, maybe we can meet secretly, and at least I can see my grandchildren for Christmas. And so from all of this, the Duchess began to get the feeling that perhaps the Queen was almost a prisoner in her own family, secretly rooting for Fergie to be this new light, and, you know, that kind of cleared up all of this darkness.
The two marriages, which had created so much renewed popularity for the Queen's family, were all but over. Still playing their individual parts, Diana and Sarah decided to leave the family together.
Early in 1992, I went on a trip to Dartmoor with John Bryan. This is very early into his involvement with the Duchess. And on the way back on the train, he told me that Princess Diana and the Duchess had formed a divorce pact some time before, where they were going to divorce their respective spouses simultaneously, but that the palace convinced them that it would be too destructive to do that, and it was going to be staged.
Fergie's departure was the dress rehearsal for the more controversial and calculating exit of Diana, who waited for her friends to reveal the truth about her marriage.
A lot of people, including myself at one time, I did believe that perhaps somebody sympathetic to Diana had leaked the story of Fergie's wish to leave Andrew, because they thought that it would help Diana to find out what would happen to Sarah if she left. It would be a kind of a rehearsal for Diana. And it certainly looked as if it was certainly beneficial to Diana, because she quickly changed her mind and put off her separation for some time. At one stage, Sarah and Diana were determined to leave together, but that didn't happen. And obviously, Diana saw that Fergie quickly was victimised by the palace.
Diana broke the pact, letting Fergie face the consequences alone. Fergie continued her public duties without palace support. Under Brian's influence, Fergie let her guard slip. The result was catastrophic. While on holiday with Johnny Bryan at a villa in the south of France, the couple were photographed together while her young children looked on. The true nature of their relationship was exposed. Bryan had posed as her financial advisor, but was revealed as her lover. Fergie believes she was set up.
And she stepped off the plane, that private plane that John rented, the Jet Air. She was photographed walking down the steps of the airplane with a scarf and sunglasses on. That photograph appeared in the local newspaper the next morning. She was followed in the car by a motorcyclist all the way to the villa that they rented. I mean, and then there was a van parked on the side of the road with one-way mirrors photographing her as she drove along. I mean, 3 tip-offs. How much more information did she need? I told her many, many times, years afterward, I said, at least on a subconscious level, admit to me you both wanted to get caught. You made too many mistakes.
Fergie believed the confident Bryan could prevent publication of the pictures. But his attempt to gain an injunction failed.
John Bryan rang Fergie to say, we've lost, the pictures are going to appear. Fergie was absolutely devastated and shell-shocked because Bryan had convinced her he'd sort it all out, as he always did. He said, don't worry, I'll sort it all out. He couldn't. And she sat down, had a large brandy, probably another large brandy, sat there all night, not being able to sleep, and, you know, had to face the royal family.
Although separated, Fergie had been invited by the Queen to Balmoral to join the royal family on their summer break. They were all there when the topless, toe-sucking pictures were published.
There are 2 versions of that, what happened. One is Sarah's version in her own autobiography, where she says she didn't go down to breakfast. And there is another version told by former friends of hers that she did go down to breakfast and she found that the Queen had left all the tabloid newspapers on her plate.
Told me that she went down to breakfast and the Queen was sitting there with all of the newspapers all lined in front of her, and that it was a very awkward moment for her. What she says in her book is that she stayed upstairs having taken a Valium pill, and that Andrew confronted the family looking nonplussed as they all looked through the newspapers, and he flipped through them too.
After apologising to the Queen, Fergie left Balmoral in disgrace. She boarded a flight at Aberdeen Airport with her children and their nanny Alison Warderley, who had comforted her during her worst moments.
My lasting memory of that day is when she came back to London, how she held her head up. She must have been through the worst experience, the most humiliating ordeal anybody could possibly have happened to them. And yet she still held her head up, and it takes guts to do that.
Fergie returned to her new home, Remenda Lodge, the house she rented after leaving Sunninghill.
She arrived back at Remenda Lodge. The world's media were waiting for her there. There was a terrible scene at the gates when she was driven in with the children on her, looking very bewildered, the children on her knee. Went inside, tried to get everything sorted out, and then went into her bedroom. And I think she just sat down and cried for the first time since it actually, the story about the pictures broke.
At Balmoral, the royal family continued their holiday, Andrew oblivious to the reality of his wife's conduct.
Andrew's attitude is quite remarkable in that Andrew genuinely doesn't believe that his wife has had these affairs. Despite the pictures, I know it sounds, fanciful, but he genuinely believes his wife's been let down by other people. He doesn't read the papers, and he doesn't believe his wife has been unfaithful to him.
By contrast, Brian loved publicity, particularly that surrounding his affair with Sarah. He even placed stories about her and Andrew in the press.
She was very much under his spell. She likes Americans. She likes their free and easy ways and their glamour, I suppose. And he was a lot of fun. And when you've got a miserable existence, somebody like that can be very captivating. So it was understandable, but inevitably she found out what he was really like, and it broke her heart.
Fergie suspected that both her love affairs were deliberately exposed by her enemies. Pictures of her with Steve Wyatt were surprisingly found in his old flat.
Again, this is January 1992 period, second week of January when those things were found, that, the palace put them there, perhaps MI5. The apartment had certainly been cleaned. Steve had no access to those photos and a million different things, just like all of the talk after the South of France pictures that had been leaked also by the palace. There's a great deal of paranoia and searches for fall guys in the form of the Grey Man or palace Machiavellian schemes, and the pictures of Steve Wyatt fell into the same category that the pictures with John Bryan ultimately were kept, in the category of a plot. And knowing Steve Wyatt and John Bryan, and these are two chaotic guys that, no, there's no plot involved here at all. They were just two careless guys that were relishing the fact that they were with a member of the royal family, and to a great deal both profited by being caught.
But for Fergie, the exposure only brought further humiliation and disgrace. She carried on with her everyday routine, taking her children to school, but her depression was evident, particularly in her neglected personal appearance. Sarah's affairs with Wyatt and Bryan cost her a royal title, and her generosity to them only added to her escalating debts. She had sought happiness, but found misery, expected a fortune, but found creditors awaiting payment.
She liked being seen as, a duchess who had very deep pockets. She liked buying gifts for people. She spent a fortune that she didn't have. And, I'm amazed that the bank, I think the bank must take an awful lot of the blame for letting someone get £4 million in debt. She went on extravagant spending sprees, money she didn't have. and then all of a sudden she'd get a statement and realise how bad things were, and she'd sort of lock herself away and get depressed, and then say, well, the only way to cheer myself up is go and spend some more money, and off she'd go again.
Life at Remenda Lodge was chaotic and expensive. Fergie's lifestyle didn't go unnoticed. She spent thousands on staff, but often answered the door herself or sorted out servants' personal problems. Madame Vasso was a frequent visitor, sometimes smuggled in for tarot card readings of Fergie's fate.
I told her at one stage that she needed to, she was £3 million in debt, and she said, oh, I need to win the lottery. She was very open about her debts, and she would frequently ask in her readings, where are the potatoes, where are the chips, which was their code word for money. And she'd say, look, when are these chips coming, Vasso? I've been waiting for so many years now. I must have the chips. You know, the bank manager's on my back, the accountants are on my back. What am I going to do? And you know, sometimes she'd break down and cry and say, I feel like I've got a 10-ton truck on my head. Sometimes she'd laugh about it and say, well, I can't really laugh. It's just, you know, I'm so deeply in debt.
Sarah was still a royal duchess. Brian realised that she could exploit her name. She planned enterprises with her business advisors.
We had these meetings for a 4-year period each month, and each month we'd come up with a new list of ideas. The first month, however, we created a list of criteria by which she could weed through all of the things. I mean, a second-rate designer blue jean company offered her $1 million to be their model for the blue jeans. A developer in New York offered her a free apartment in a Central Park South location just to say that she lived there. We were given all kinds of money-making opportunities all the time.
Inspired by flying helicopters, Fergie had created the character Budgie for a series of children's stories. Pocketing most of the profits had brought her severe criticism.
She wrote these books. Immediately there was a big stink caused that because she didn't turn over all the royalties to charity. Well, she said, well, why should I? You know, it's all very well for Prince Charles to donate money from his books because he has this vast income from the Duchy of Cornwall. So I think she was quite justified in what she did, but it did get her in a very bad odour with everybody, from the media to the public, and it was totally unfair.
Come on, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Fergie still tried to help raise funds for others. She continued her work in Britain and in missions to Eastern Europe after she set up her own charity.
It's for £18,816.56. That's incredible. This little person had the shirt on upside down and no love, and we need to really help them now. Look at this, look at the lovely eyes. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
However well-intentioned, Fergie's motives were questioned. She was accused of mixing charitable and commercial schemes, arising from her well-publicised support of charities in Eastern Europe.
I don't really look at it that way. The Duchess's budget was in such a confusion that very often she'd pay personally for charity trips that could have been reimbursed, and she'd take money from revenues generated from press events associated with the charity trips as expense money to pay legitimate expenses, albeit too over-the-top expenses for traveling with this royal entourage, which wasn't really needed. But she didn't milk the charities directly for money. No, she didn't do that at all. What she did do is she used the charities, in my opinion, as an alibi to win love and acceptance, as sort of a mask of legitimacy for ventures that she doesn't want to take responsibility for having done for more selfish reasons. It is serving the role of an alibi. It's complex, like everything that she does.
Sarah's relationships with the Queen and the royal family remain complex. Neither she nor Diana are invited to royal events. Their relationship, too, has a downside.
Diana's relationship with the Duchess fluctuated quite a bit during the 4.5 years that I was involved with the Duchess, but for the majority of the time, the relationship was highly competitive. They were fighting an ongoing battle through use of their charities and using the press as a weapon. They would look like actresses on opening night at the reviews of their latest charity trips and compare them and whine if the other one got better reviews. No, it was a highly competitive relationship.
They fell out once over some charity work which Sarah promoted, an AIDS charity, and Diana rang her up and said, "What on earth do you think you're doing, trying to hijack a charity that I've done, a cause that I've done so much for?" And slammed the phone down. And Fergie tried to get through. She wouldn't take the call, so she faxed her, faxed her saying, "Look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you." And because of that silly little incident, they didn't speak for weeks.
They've had their ups and downs. Somebody in the family once compared it to being just like sisters. Sisters occasionally have rows and fall out, and that's what's happened to them.
In 1996, Sarah and Diana were divorced from their royal husbands and stripped of the title Her Royal Highness. Their settlements reflected their unequal status. Fergie received several £100,000, immediately swallowed up by her massive debts. Diana, as mother of a future king, gained £15 million. Holidaying together in the south of France, they considered their uncertain futures.
Diana would tell, Fergie what was wrong with her life, and vice versa. They're in a unique position as being married to, princes, members of the royal family, and perhaps were the only ones who were capable of understanding what the other's problems were.
Fergie loves her daughters, but they are undoubtedly passports to royal connections.
Children were always paramount in her thoughts, and the thing that terrified her more than anything whatsoever was losing the girls. I think she'll look back and realise that she did some things which she shouldn't have done.
She and Andrew have stayed friends. Their children still feel part of a family.
What she got out of the marriage, which was two beautiful little girls who are her total joy, her greatest comfort in life, and she would never turn the clock back and be without them because she adores them and they adore her.
Early in October of '92, she and I were talking about families and children, and I was at that point thinking of starting up a family. She said, "Alan, if you're not 100% sure, don't have children. They are such pests."
However, New York publishers were quick to see the commercial potential of Fergie as the royal mother.
We can market her as a mother. She is, after all, a mother. We need to redefine her as an expert on motherhood. Simon & Schuster, along with Rubenstein, her PR firm, has marketed her as a mother. And so we believe now, because we've been fed this, that she's a good mother. Is she, though? Or is she sort of a distant mother who spends a great deal of time traveling and a great deal of time involved with her own problems? I don't know. I think the jury's out on that one.
Sarah Ferguson assumed an almost other identity called Fergie, Duchess of York. At times, an irresponsible person who lived and grew before the public eye and whose immaturity was at times overwhelming. She's left her rented home and moved back temporarily to the marital home, Sunninghill Park House, in an effort to downscale her expensive lifestyle. She may be divorced, but Fergie is nevertheless jealous of Andrew's friendship with attractive Henriette Peace. She has warned her not to get too close to her ex-husband, whom she says she still loves. Fergie could still find a wealthy new husband. Meanwhile, she's obliged to take every money-making opportunity to chip away at her huge tax bill. "I don't want to be commercial," she claims, "but I have to be." Whatever will Fergie do next?
July 1981, the fairy tale wedding of the century, as a 20-year-old girl sets out to marry her Prince Charming at St. Paul's Cathedral. 700 million people watched her transformation from commoner to royal princess and expected her to live happily ever after. 12 years later, Diana, Princess of Wales, made a public announcement that finally shattered the fairy tale.
When I started my public life 12 years ago, I understood the media might be interested in what I did. I realized then their attention would inevitably focus on both our private and public lives. But I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become, nor the extent to which it would affect both my public duties and my personal life in a manner that's been hard to bear. Obviously, I attach great importance to my charity work, and I intend to focus on a smaller range of areas in the future. Over the next few months, I will be seeking a more suitable way of combining a meaningful public role with hopefully a more private life. My first priority will continue to be our children, William and Harry, who deserve as much love and care and attention as I am able to give, as well as an appreciation of the tradition into which they were born.
200 years before, another Princess of Wales, Caroline of Brunswick, had fallen out with her husband, later to become George IV.
There were all those outrageous Hanoverians who, sin was on the menu every day for them. And they did everything. They were in debt. There was even a suggestion of incest amongst two children of George III. That is Queen Victoria's grandfather. And they had illegitimate children by the dozen. One of them, the future William IV, actually had 10 illegitimate children before he married the legal wife who became his queen.
Queen Victoria succeeded William, and in 1840 she married Prince Albert. Their eldest son Edward was soon to acquire a taste for sexual adventure in Ireland.
Edward, who had, it was called Bertie, by the way, had a fall. It was called Bertie's fall when, as a very young man of 19 in the Curragh, while serving the army, had found the Camp Pro in his bed, placed there by his fellow officers. And nature took its course. The parents learned of it, and there was a hell of a to-do about it. It was called Bertie's Fall, and he was never allowed to forget it.
His marriage to the royal princess Alexandra of Denmark was meant to keep him out of trouble. She seemed the perfect choice.
The fact about Alexandra that most attracted Queen Victoria, and also Albert, who was alive when the marriage was arranged, was that she was just utterly beautiful. And they thought if the woman was beautiful, he wouldn't stray. But the marriage with Alexandra, whom he had met, he declared himself in love, but that could have been just politic, for him to do. Was definitely arranged to stop him from straying. And pretty well, as soon as he got her home and pregnant, which he did very quickly, he was off. And he had so many mistresses in the end, right to the time he died, that I think he lost count of them.
Daisy, the Countess of Warwick, was one of Edward's particular favourites for many years, the actress Lily Langtry another. In those days, a Princess of Wales was expected just to put up with her husband's philandering. By today's standards, Alexandra showed remarkable tolerance.
She was friends with a lot of them. She was not a particularly bright woman, but she was extremely gracious and forbearing, and I think she loved him for all his straying. She made friends with these mistresses, and, on his deathbed, she was the one who called his last mistress, Mrs. Alice Keppel, to see him for the last time, which was an act of great magnanimity.
By a peculiar quirk of fate, Alice Keppel's great-granddaughter is Camilla Parker Bowles, Prince Charles's mistress. History can repeat itself, and Camilla is known to have played upon this fact.
There was the famous moment when they first met back in the 70s, when Camilla, the great-granddaughter of Alice Keppel, favourite mistress of his great-great-grandfather Edward VII, reminded Prince Charles of this fact and said, "So how about it then?" And that was how their relationship began, and that's one of the aspects of Camilla that rather appeals to the man in the street, who otherwise can't understand why on earth this man left Diana for this not so obviously attractive woman.
Diana was everyone's idea of what a princess should be, but she was not prepared to hide the true state of her marriage, unlike Edward VII's wife.
Alexander belonged to a generation which sort of put up and shut up over the affairs of their husbands. And after all Diana has had to put up with is one long-standing affair. In fact, he's been very faithful in his infidelity, has Charles, hasn't he? Whereas Alexandra had to share her husband with a parade of women.
Charles is a very different man from his great-great-grandfather. He likes painting and solitary pursuits.
Charles is a serious man. He's has intellectual interests that would never have occurred to Edward VII. I mean, Edward VII was a man who hardly ever read a book. He was a great king in the social sense, and he was politically very astute. But he had no intellectual pretensions. In fact, after his education, which had been rammed down his throat and out of his ears, he ran away from that sort of thing. I would say Charles is his own man.
In contrast to Charles's German ancestry, Lady Diana Spencer brought with her a pure English bloodline. The Spencers of Althorp have been wealthy landowners since the 16th century, with a history of faithful royal service going back generations. Rich and powerful, they've always been one of England's great noble families.
I think the Spencer family, which of course is a much more British and much older and more traditionally British family than the Windsors, probably does carry in its genes the grit and determination and stubbornness that Diana has quite rightly shown in being the first Princess of Wales in British history not to tolerate her husband having affairs.
By standing up to the royal family, Diana earned respect from those who once wrote her off as just a pretty airhead.
Once she stamped her foot on behalf of womankind, she became an icon praised by Camille Parlier and all feminists around the world. It's why she's become, quite rightly, an icon for feminism, whereas previously she was just some clothes peg, famous because of who her husband was. But let's not forget, she's the daughter of a hereditary earl. When Diana is accused of wanting to destroy the monarchy, it's total nonsense. She believes in the hereditary principle. She wants her son to be king. She doesn't necessarily want her husband to be king, but she wants her son to be king.
One Prince of Wales who was born to be king but never became one was David, the never-crowned Edward VIII. After his abdication, it was left to his brother Albert to pick up the pieces. George V and Queen Mary were far from ideal parents, and David's austere upbringing probably contributed to his desertion of duty.
He never had a mother who really was really what he wanted. Queen Mary was somewhat cold. She didn't like children, she didn't like childbirth, she didn't like pregnancy, and she didn't like what went before either. She did it all out of duty, and it reflected in her relationships with her children.
Her second son, Albert, Duke of York, was a sickly child, always under the shadow of his more confident brother.
His health had never been good. When he was a child, he was born a year after the future Edward VIII, so they were in the nursery together, and their nurse was actually psychotic. It's a measure of the lack of care Queen Mary took that such a person ever got to be in charge of the two princes. And she neglected him for the sake of her his elder brother, whom she preferred. She didn't feed him properly. She just didn't look after him properly, and he had ulcers and he developed a stammer. That was probably because he was bullied by his father. He had every nervous sort of manifestation you can imagine.
Queen Mary was a very forbidding figure. You just look at photographs of her, very, very shy, very reserved, and quite unable to talk about what was in her heart. You could not imagine a royal child climbing on her lap and giving her a great big hug. It just wasn't on.
Psychologists would now recognise them as a dysfunctional family.
They were terrified of their parents. I mean, they were emotionally repressed. I mean, they were frightened of their mothers, they were frightened of their fathers. And conversation was absolutely painful, with the most terrible tension. There's no cheerful family banter. And I mean, George V, if he was talking to his children, he would bark a series of challenging questions at them. And these poor little children were so frightened. You know, they would cry, but they could never answer. And then he would get into a terrible rage. And then there was the other brother, the Duke of Gloucester, known in the family as Glossy Pops, affectionately, where he was so frightened of King George V that one morning he was a minute late for breakfast. But rather than face the wrath of his father, he fainted at his feet. And, you know, so frightened was he. And this was typical of all of them.
Despite his unhappy childhood, David, as Prince of Wales, showed a self-confidence that made him immensely popular. But his private life was already unorthodox.
The trouble with Edward VIII, when Prince of Wales, and he was a very good Prince of Wales for a very long time, was that he had a penchant for married women. And he had two mistresses, Mrs. Frida Dudley Ward and Thelma Lady Furness. And it was mostly because of his attachment to Frida Dudley Ward, who came first, when he was about 18, that she sort of kept him unmarried. It was difficult to prize him away from her in order to get it long enough for him to sort of even pay attention to anyone else.
David, on the left, had very different tastes in women to his shy brother Bertie on the right.
There was some talk that he was going to marry Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and you know who she came to be. I mean, they were horrified when this thing came out, and both strove to deny it very, very vigorously, particularly him. It isn't that she wasn't beautiful, because she was utterly beautiful, but she was just not his type, and nor was he hers. And actually, the Duke of York, or rather Prince Albert, as he really was rather in the background because he was shy and awkward and, you know, he stammered and he didn't think he was good enough for her. And there's no reason to think that she thought the same way, but there were all these other glamorous lads who got in the way. Eventually, because he was so persistent, he got to her and she realised what a lovely person he was.
It is with the greatest pleasure that the King and Queen announce the betrothal of their beloved son, the Duke of York, to the Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of the Earl and Countess of Strathmore.
He had a terrible temper, inherited from his father, made worse by the fact that he had the stammer, by the fact that he was so shy, so nervous, so, in a way, unresolved. This made his temper very short. He had a terrible temper, a really kind of shouting temper.
When the pressures of being the Duke of York upset him, Elizabeth could always calm him.
If something went slightly wrong, he would get absolutely furious. And she would just take his wrist and say, "Now, Bertie," quietly, tick, 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 and just sort of as if taking his pulse would calm him, and it used to work miraculously.
Meanwhile, the Prince of Wales had fallen deeply in love with the twice-married Wallis Simpson. She fascinated him.
One thing, being an American, she wasn't really in awe of the king as much, say, as a British woman would have been. She spoke her mind. She was a woman, a very confident woman of the world. She spoke to him as an equal. She wasn't as deferential as most people were. Certainly all those Debs that he met here were terrified of him. He didn't ever like young, unmarried girls that go out. All his mistresses were women with husbands. That's what he liked. A confident woman, a bossy woman, a woman who knew her way around in the world. And the Duchess of Windsor, Wallis Simpson, was the supreme bossy woman all their life. She simply bossed him. She's a woman who had two husbands living and very self-confident. And this, I think, is what appealed to him more than anything.
In 1936, David became King Edward VIII and ascended the throne briefly before abdicating in order to marry the now divorced Wallis Simpson. The wedding had to take place in France, away from a shocked Britain.
They all hated her. They thought that she had, you know, she had stolen the king. She had made him lose his crown. They all thought she was a terrible adventuress. They all thought she was simply after the position. And what they all thought was that once she had got him, once she had married him and wasn't the queen, that she would ditch him as she had ditched two other husbands. They assumed she was simply an adventuress who was after the throne, and once she didn't get it, that she would clear off. That fact didn't happen. But that is why they thought she was just really a good-time girl, is what they thought she was.
David's abdication was a terrible blow to his stammering, uncertain brother. Next in line of succession, Bertie had no choice but to be crowned King George VI in 1937. He'd had no training and was totally unprepared for the role.
This very nervous, very diffident, very insecure kind of man with no public presence whatsoever. And suddenly, overnight, and literally overnight, he had to become the King of England. And he really was very, very shaken by this. He burst into tears. He sat on the sofa with Queen Mary in floods of tears because he simply couldn't face the prospect, and he simply had to do it. There was no way out of it.
Somehow he had to make the best of it and restore Britain's faith in its monarchy. He made a very shaky start, and to begin with, things looked bleak.
Certainly in the early days, really until the war broke out, which in a way consolidated his position because he was admired greatly, he and the Queen, for staying in England and for everything they did. But yes, he was very worried because his brother had this wonderful kind of crowd-pleasing ability. He could enthuse the crowds. He was extremely popular, very good with people, very good with small talk, all the things which the new king, King George VI, simply had no talent for, that kind of public life whatsoever. So really he did mind the fact that this very popular brother had gone, leaving this rather diffident, this rather colourless man in his place. He felt that very much.
David and Wallis, now the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, were never welcomed back to Britain. They lived in exile in Paris.
One reason he didn't come back was because of tax. He went to live in France because there was an arrangement there whereby he didn't pay tax. He did think he might live in the States at one stage, but he would have to pay tax there, so he wouldn't live there. But no, the main reason he didn't come back to this country is because George VI and Queen Elizabeth didn't want him here. They didn't want him to come back and live here as a kind of rival to the King and Queen, so they never really ever wanted him to come and live here. They were quite happy if he lived anywhere except in Britain.
They also refused to grant Wallis the title Her Royal Highness.
He thought that she was absolutely worthy of it. He thought that this is the least he could do. If he couldn't make her queen, and he was determined at one stage that she would be queen, and she was determined to be queen, the least that he could do for her was to make her a royal highness, and this is what he spent really his whole life battling for. This is the one supreme battle of his life. More important than anything was to make her a royal highness, and a battle, of course, which he never won.
Following the end of the war, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth set sail with their two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, for an official visit to South Africa in 1947. This was their first time away from the pressures of wartime Britain, and the world was able to see just how relaxed and united they were as a family.
Queen Mother, as she is today, had come herself from a very warm, loving family, from the Bowes-Lyon family. And so she created a very happy atmosphere for her children, Princess Elizabeth, Princess Margaret. She also knew that her beloved Bertie had had such an unhappy childhood. She was determined to create the right kind of atmosphere. And even when he became king after the abdication and they moved to the palace, she tried very hard there to create a good, warm atmosphere, and would run down to the palace kitchens and make scones for Princess Margaret and Princess Elizabeth.
But Elizabeth had had to grow up in the knowledge that she would eventually succeed her father as monarch. At 21, she made the most important statement of her life.
It was in South Africa in 1947, the only tour she made with her father and mother and her sister, that she dedicated her entire life on her 21st birthday to serving the Commonwealth and this country, the United Kingdom.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
On her return from South Africa, it was with delight that the country learned of her engagement to Lieutenant Mountbatten. As heiress presumptive to the throne,
Her choice of a husband was obviously a matter of intimate concern to every one of her father's subjects. With quick perception, the public realized that she had made a worthy choice.
She met him when she was 13 years old. He was a young man of, let's see, he must have been about 18, very good looking, like all the Mountbattens, and she fell for him. They became quite friendly, and he, in an elder brotherly way, used to write to her. Now, it's not every sort of 18, 19-year-old young man in the Navy who writes to 13, 14-year-old girls. So there was obviously a liking there from the start. They definitely chose each other. That was definitely a love match.
Elizabeth and Philip were married in November 1947. After the dark days of the war, it was an event that lifted the nation, and huge crowds wished their future queen well. At the glittering wedding ceremony in Westminster Abbey, everyone had great hopes for this fortuitous love match between the House of Windsor and the Greek royal family. As a royal prince, there was every confidence that Philip would make an admirable consort. But few guessed how soon his new wife would have to take on the duties of a monarch. The pressures of having to lead Britain during the long war years had taken their toll on her father. By 1952, he was too ill to travel, and Elizabeth had to leave for an official tour on his behalf. She said farewell to him for the last time. Within a few days, he was dead, at only 56 years old, and the nation mourned.
I mean, the last 4 kings of England were killed by smoking, and he was one of them. But he was a likely candidate for an early death. Then there was the shock of the abdication, which he greeted in floods of tears, because he'd never been prepared for it, never expected it, and wasn't suited to it. And then came the war, which was a tremendous strain. And if you look at a picture of King George VI in 1939, even in his early 40s, he was young, he was handsome, he was upstanding, he had all his hair and all that. And at the end, he was at 49, he was drawn, he was tired, he was obviously completely played out. It ruined him. I think actually the Second World War did for him far more than the abdication did.
His daughter was crowned Elizabeth II in June 1953, the first coronation to be televised. Millions of people all over the world witnessed the start of what was hailed as the new Elizabethan age. There was a feeling of great hope and expectation. At only 27, it was a huge responsibility for the new queen to take on, but in Philip, she had a strong, supportive consort.
I don't think she could have chosen better, apart from the fact that he had very fine royal lineage in his own right. He was exactly the sort of character that she needed behind her as queen. Strong, he was manly, he was strict when he needed to be. I think it was a very, very suitable match, and it came about through their own personal choice.
In public terms, I think Prince Philip's been an excellent consort to the Queen. You could almost compare him with Dennis Thatcher and Margaret. It's very difficult for a forthright man of strong views to surrender his identity to his wife, to walk one pace behind her and so on. He's had constant difficulties with that, but he may have put the odd foot wrong, made the odd inappropriate remark, but beyond that, he's done extremely well.
But royal life can be boring for those on the sidelines, and without a job of his own, Philip's attention has strayed, and he sought other women's company.
I think what is extraordinary is the way that all the rumours about his private life that one hears if one moves in these circles have never become public. Kitty Kelly is famously writing a book about him at the moment that may alter all that. But one of the questions I'm constantly asked is how has Philip got away from it, with it all these years? And until a few years ago, to attack Philip would have been to attack the Queen, so he was hors de combat, he was beyond the pale. I think that may be coming to an end now, and I suspect the next few years may hold some difficulties for Philip, in which he might choose, quite rightly, to reach for his lawyers.
In the early days of Elizabeth's reign, it was her sister Margaret who was getting all the press attention. She was the royal everyone wanted to see.
In the way she was a kind of star. She really, in her day, had the sort of star quality which Diana has now. She used to dress very well. She looked lovely in her day, Princess Margaret, and she was that kind of princess who could really bring something out in the crowds in the way that Diana can. It's a kind of quality, a kind of personal magnetism which some of them have got, that some of them acquire. And in a way, yes, Princess Margaret was the Diana of her day and was very much the star of the royal family in the 1950s especially.
Always a great supporter of the arts, perhaps in a different life, Margaret might have become an actress herself. As a royal princess, she often stole the limelight from famous film stars, and the press were fascinated by how she naturally took centre stage.
Princess Margaret's problem in the 50s was that she was so stunningly beautiful. She was regarded as the royal family's equivalent of Elizabeth Taylor. And she was so beautiful. She was a fairy tale princess in every sense of the word in those wonderful Hartnell gowns she wore.
But her glamorous public appearances hid a private tragedy. In her early 20s, she'd fallen deeply in love with her father's unhappily married equerry, Captain Peter Townsend.
She lost the man she loved, and it ruined her because she was afterwards unable to make a relationship with anybody else. It's difficult to know, actually, who would have satisfied Princess Margaret. Someone much stronger than herself, and that would have been a real beefy man, because she's a very strong, outward-going character, very talented.
People expected her to live happily ever after, a fantasy life. That's not the way it is in the real world. She was seen with what was regarded as unsuitable men, created a lot of scandal, caused a lot of discussion in the House of Commons. People thought she should be stripped of all her privileges and her civil list allowance. Everybody's forgotten about that now, and I think that it's just as well they have, because she sacrificed a great deal to stay in the royal family and do her duty, and it's about time we all recognise that.
In 1960, she married a commoner, the well-connected society photographer Anthony Armstrong-Jones. But it was a marriage destined to end in divorce.
I think she's probably not an easy woman to live with. She was used to, she's a princess, a king's daughter, very imperious, used to getting her own way. Armstrong-Jones wasn't prepared to do this, I don't think. He wanted his own career, quite rightly. Margaret was a difficult person. One hears there were various extramarital interests. So in a way, it was a very difficult situation. I think it was inevitable that it should break up, really.
35 years later, Margaret has never remarried. She's a woman alone. The year these pictures were taken, her first love, Peter Townsend, died in France. Back in the 50s, his divorce status was an insurmountable barrier to his marrying a Queen's sister. Today, the love match would no doubt have been allowed. Tragically, Margaret was young at the wrong time. Unable to find someone to take Townsend's place, she casts a lonely shadow over the royal family.
She never really seems at ease in her position in the world. I think she's never really accustomed herself to how a princess fits into modern life.
It seems to have been impossible for Margaret ever to find happiness again, because any man who takes on marrying a royal princess is taking on a hell of a lot. He's giving up, he's saying goodbye to his private life. He's really as much a prisoner as his wife is. And so it could be that we may see in 30 years' time Diana living in exactly the same position that Princess Margaret's in today.
Another princess destined to have a royal marriage without a happy ending was Queen Elizabeth's only daughter, Anne. Her wedding in 1973 was greeted with optimism. A world-class horsewoman, Anne had chosen a fellow enthusiast, Captain Mark Phillips. With a great deal in common, their future together looked full of hope.
They fell in love and wanted to get married. They were both interested in horses, which is a great interest. They're both extremely good at horsemanship. But I simply don't think he was up to it. It's not easy for a man to be married to a woman whose family is much more important than his own, whose income is much bigger than his own, whose profile is enormously higher than his own. This is the problem for current royals. because of the demise of so many other royal families or the lack of respectability that some of them have suffered, it's very difficult for them to find anyone suitable to marry who's got comparable status to theirs.
She is rather full of herself. She is very like her father, Prince Philip. And she has not endeared herself to the nation. She's done some very good work, so there is no doubt of that, but that's her job, basically. She gets paid for it, and she gets a very nice car to drive around and a wonderful wardrobe of clothes. She lives in a fabulous house and has got and although she's got a tiny flat in Dolphin Square, she never goes there. She lives the life of Riley, and we would expect her to do the things that she does.
While press attention was on her brother Charles's marital problems, Anne divorced and swiftly remarried her lover, Commander Tim Lawrence, a royal equerry. The wedding ceremony was modest and discreet at Crathy Church on the Balmoral estate in Scotland. Members of the royal family, including the Queen, were on hand to give this new liaison their blessing. Again, Anne had got her own way with very little press criticism.
The divorce of Princess Anne, Princess Royal, from Mark Phillips barely caused a ripple in the royal scene and didn't dent her image one little bit. She just carried on as if nothing had happened. The palace went out of its way to say when there was a separation, A, that there were no plans for divorce, which we knew was absolute rubbish, because they knew, Mark and Anne both knew when they got separated that they were going to be divorced within 2 years. And when they were divorced, the palace then said there was no third party involved. And we all knew that at that time she had a friendship with Tim Lawrence, because letters written by him to her and her to him had been stolen by somebody, presumably in the palace, and had been made public.
Tim Lawrence is not known for his horsemanship, and on the face of it has very little in common with his wife.
Tim Lawrence is quite extraordinary in that he comes from a background which couldn't be further removed from Princess Anne's. I mean, if he tried, he comes from a working class background. Strangely enough, since he's been in the royal family, he's become even more royal than the royals and indistinguishable from any of them. He looks like them, he dresses like them, he even talks like them. And as somebody unkindly said to me a few days ago at Buckingham Palace, he's taken on this air of assumed aristocracy.
Anne is a matrimonial pioneer, the first member of the royal family to ever divorce and remarry. As Tim Lawrence appears to be fitting seamlessly into his new position as royal husband, the signs are good she'll be lucky a second time around. Queen Elizabeth's second son, Andrew, married another commoner, Sarah Ferguson, in 1986. This wedding day had an exuberant atmosphere new to royal occasions. Guests and family seemed unusually lively to match the character of the new bride, and the overall mood was relaxed and informal, despite the inevitable pomp and ceremony. Even the Queen entered into the spirit of things, obviously happy that her favourite son had finally met his match in the spirited redhead the press had nicknamed Fergie. This was one girl who could keep her playboy son in check. The reigning monarch never looked happier. Diana too appeared to be enjoying the acceptance of someone her own age into the royal family. Here finally was an ally to help loosen up the stuffy traditions of the Windsors. But would Sarah last the course? And were she and Andrew really suited? With hindsight, they were a disaster in the making.
I think they're a very ill-matched pair. I mean, there are some people who simply should not marry each other. She was a hot potato, that one. I think Andrew wanted somebody more like Duchess of Gloucester. Quiet, not a great personality, nice woman, not a sort of tornado like Sarah Ferguson. I think I don't think he knew what he was getting himself into. She, because she had a broken romance herself, was probably at a low ebb and perhaps looked a bit more vulnerable than she later turned out to be.
But Andrew is not an easy person himself. Spoilt and naturally arrogant like his father, he can be unpredictable with sudden changes of mood.
He's been described as boorish and uneducated, and other people say that he's remarkably sensitive. I know people who have worked with him and for him, and they said he can be a bit like his father, give you a real dressing down for no apparent reason, and the next moment he can be so thoughtful, so completely and absolutely thoughtful. He's not, I understand, a very cerebral man. He's not one of the deep thinkers of this world, but the very fact that he's qualified as a helicopter pilot and he's now commanding his own ship, HMS Cottesmore, leads one to believe that he does possess a rare amount of intelligence.
From the start, Sarah didn't see much of her husband, and this caused problems.
I believe that if Andrew hadn't gone away to a Navy college just days after they married, leaving Fergie alone and rather depressed at Buckingham Palace in the early days of their marriage, they may have worked something out. But the combination of living in that great mausoleum that we call Buckingham Palace, there's constant spotlight, constant publicity, the endless criticism, not just from courtiers but also from the media. It wore Fergie down to such an extent that when she wanted the man in her life to be by her side, he was either away at sea or on a Navy course.
Sarah turned to other men for company and support. This was soon picked up by the press and made banner headlines.
I think she has always needed the presence of a powerful male figure in her life. For a long time, that was her father. And it has been replaced by a string of men who tended to be older and manipulative.
The final straw was when photographs of Sarah with her financial advisor, Johnny Bryan, exposed the real intimate nature of their relationship. It made worldwide front-page news, as although Buckingham Palace had announced that Andrew and Sarah were to separate 6 months before, no plans for divorce had been mentioned, and they were still officially married. Her blatant disregard for her marriage vows shook the very foundations of respect that supports the monarchy. Sarah was at Balmoral when the photographs hit the nation's breakfast tables. It was left to Johnny, a Texan businessman based in London, to face the press.
Where's your comment, Mr. Bryan? Sorry, I have no further comment to make in addition to the comments and statements I made last night. Have you seen the...
At this point, he was keeping his story to himself, but his insider knowledge would fetch a high price if he ever decided to do a kiss-and-tell exposé. A dangerously loose cannon, who has now been declared bankrupt in Germany, he could blow a very large hole in the royal family's traditional armour of privacy and discretion.
The difficulty with John Bryan is that he is American, he is not tied into our royal family or the way that we perceive our royal family. And sooner or later, if the relationship fails, we can see him in America selling his story. And it's not just the story about him and the Duchess of York. He knows about the relationship between the Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales. He knows about the Queen, he knows about Prince Philip, he knows everything. And if he decided to tell his story, that is the most extraordinary time bomb. Fergie and John Bryan have entered into some kind of devil's contract, which neither of them can get out of. But if it continues in the way that it has been going on, could ultimately bring down the House of Windsor, because sooner or later, Fergie will have to distance herself from John Bryan. His business activities do not bear close scrutiny, and he created enemies wherever he has gone. He's a bully. He's an uncomfortable figure to be around, but basically he knows where the bodies are buried.
Despite his wife's behaviour, the Duke of York didn't want a divorce. For 4 years, he attempted a reconciliation.
Prince Andrew did not want to let his wife go, and he tried to woo her back again. And they maintained a very friendly relationship because they are good friends, as well as for the sake of their children. Now, this was not the case with the Waleses, who were definitely, there was a war of the Waleses, and there was a lot of sniping at each other from their deeply entrenched positions.
The exposure in 1992 of the true breakdown in the Waleses' marriage came as no great surprise, but its constitutional importance required the Prime Minister, John Major, to address Parliament.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected. This decision has been reached amicably, and they will both continue to participate fully in the upbringing of their children.
The carefully built image of monarchy as an example of family values and stability has been severely dented.
there is not one significant marriage which has survived the royal family. Princess Margaret's marriage ended in divorce, Princess Anne's ended in divorce, Duke and Duchess of York, Prince and Princess of Wales. So there's something about the royal family and the way that they behave towards outsiders which is very questionable. At the same time, it's very difficult for an outsider to cope with life in the goldfish bowl of Buckingham Palace.
Diana may have been divorced from Charles, but she was never able to escape being hounded by the press. They were always on the hunt for any sign that she'd found another man. It was a constant pressure.
Come on, get lost.
We go directly to the plane.
Come on, get lost.
S'il vous plaît, monsieur.
Thank you. Please.
One of the main problems for the younger generation of royals now moving towards middle age is that they're the first ones to conduct life the way they want to in the age of the mass media, the inquiring media, photo lenses coming through windows and so on. If you look back to previous generations, Edward VII, who is now well known to have had a string of mistresses, Mrs. Keppel, Lily Langtry, etc., and a wife who looked the other way. There may have been rumours around the nation about the King's or the Prince of Wales's behaviour, but it wasn't in the newspapers every day. Edward VIII, who became Duke of Windsor and was briefly Edward VIII after being Prince of Wales, talks in his memoirs, he's the only king of England ever to have written his memoirs, about artists with sketch pads jumping out from behind trees as he's walking through the park, and complains about this. What he would say about the paparazzi, I suppose that was the 30s equivalent, I've no idea. But that obviously is the problem, that the monarchy has moulded itself into the first family of the land, a paragon of Christian virtue, a paragon of family life, and when that has self-evidently collapsed, as it has over the last 5 years, 3 out of 3 of the Queen's children's marriages have collapsed, the 4th as yet has not got married, then the monarchy is robbed of its reason for being there.
If family marriage problems weren't enough, 1992 saw the Windsor's ancestral home burst into flames. It seemed a fitting symbol for an afflicted monarchy apparently self-destructing in its scandals and marriage breakdowns. Was this a sign that an ancient dynasty was coming to an end? The Queen broke the habit of a lifetime by openly sharing her feelings with her subjects.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
But within 3 years, the monarchy seemed to be projecting a more confident image. For the 50th anniversary of VE Day, the focus was on family continuity, with the Queen in forthright red.
She's devoted her entire life to repairing the damage done by the abdication in 1936, and her father tried to do the same, but because his reign was so short, it was left to his daughter to really do the major work, and she's successfully done that. Everything was going fine until the mid-80s.
This balcony appearance emphasised that strong women are still at the helm of the royal family.
Queen Mother and the Queen and Princess Margaret represented the wartime generation. That was fair enough, but I think there was only more in it. I think they didn't want to clutter up that balcony with all the other members of the family who've been rather less than well-behaved recently. I think they wanted back to the time during the war and even after, when the royal family were greatly admired, when they were greatly esteemed by the public, and this in a way was a little image, a little public image of the royal family. In happier days, they want to leave the public with this impression, I think.
A new royal wedding, this time between Princess Margaret's son, Viscount Linley, and Serena Stanhope. As the royal family gathered at Westminster Abbey, there was hope yet again that this time the marriage of a royal to a commoner might work. Even as an estranged divorced wife, Diana wasn't banished from royal occasions. Diana's life was like a melodrama. She was the girl who seemed to have everything except the one thing that would make it perfect, someone to share it with. Diana's brief romance with Dodi Fayed was cut short with her tragic death in the summer of 1997. Prior to that relationship, there were many men who were willing to take her under their arm, but Diana was always aware that any man she would fall in love with could eventually become stepfather to a future king. Diana's divorce settlement had to reflect the nation's love and esteem for her. Prince Charles's lawyers pleaded poverty and let it be known that he would offer a sum in the region of £4 million. In the event, a settlement of £15 million was agreed, yielding an annual income of about £100,000. Not a huge sum, bearing in mind her lost royal status. Following her divorce and loss of the title Her Royal Highness, Diana withdrew from mainstream public duties and resigned as patron of more than 100 charities. Her interest and loving care was a loss to the nation. Right up until her death, Diana remained in touch with her good causes and continued as patron of 5 of her principal charities, including the Royal Marsden and the Great Ormond Street Hospitals, the Leprosy Mission and the National AIDS Trust. Although partially in exile as she waited for her financial settlement and divorce arrangements to be finalized, the public's adoration made up for much of the sadness and loneliness in her personal life. During her marriage, Diana was starved of love, romance, and affection, to such a degree that many of her friends felt that after her separation, she would fall for the first hussar who swept her off her feet. On royal occasions, she handled her unique situation as the ex-wife of the heir to the throne with dignity. The royal family, particularly the Queen, was pleased with the way she handled her difficult role. There were 1 or 2 mistakes which were not always Diana's fault, but she always behaved with great maturity and handled the shared custody of her 2 children well, especially at Christmas and Easter, when the Queen wished them to be seen with the royal family. Above all, for Diana, the happiness of her children was paramount in all she did. Her search for a suitable partner filled thousands of column inches in newspapers and magazines around the world. Mr. Wonderful had to fit the dream of most women. He had to be Mr. Right, Sir Right, and Lord Right, with the background and the financial support to keep Diana in the style to which she and her adoring public were accustomed. Always ready with a smile, Diana continued with her most treasured charity work for the underprivileged, those less fortunate, the have-nots. Their warmth and understanding kept her going at even the bleakest moments.
Your kindness and affection has carried me through some of the most difficult periods. And always, your love and care has eased that journey. And for that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Virtues